Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Olympus educator and wedding and portrait photographer Joseph Ellis, and today we're talking about the EM5 Mark III. Let's get into it. So I've had my EM5 Mark III for a few days now, put it through I think 3 or 4 professional shoots, a couple of personal shoots, and done some video. I've also had it out in the pouring rain, so I think I've put it through its paces, and based on my knowledge of all the other OMD cameras, it was pretty easy for me to jump into this one and understand it pretty well. So here are my thoughts. At a base level, I really think that the EM5 Mark III is the Olympus model that people are going to fall in love with. When I talk to tons of photographers who are thinking about jumping into OMD, into the Olympus ecosystem, they're looking for a camera body that can replace their DSLR, that offers that fun factor, that offers that portability, that offers, everything that they want in a camera. This would be the perfect model to give them as a recommendation, because every feature that Olympus is famous for is present here, and it offers the ultimate portability in terms of a system camera, and it can handle 99.9% of any photographic task that you throw at it. It really is like an EM1 Mark II that's been shrunk a little bit and now at a price point that is just unbelievable. If I think back to my origins into Micro Four Thirds, it was right around the time of the EM5 Mark II that was coming out, when I was kind of like looking at the system. After having shot the 4/3 system even before that, I took a foray into full frame and all that kind of jazz for my professional work, just because, back in those days there were a few features that were just critical for me that were missing. But when the EM5 Mark II came out and I was looking at what it could do, I thought, if I had that as a third camera, what could I do with it? How could I use it? And so it really was sort of the one that I fell in love with. It convinced me that the Olympus OMD system was ready for prime time. And then with the introduction of the EM1 Mark II, with the dual card slots and the bigger battery and the better continuous autofocus, I really hit a sweet spot for what I needed in terms of a camera that will do the work that I do. And so when they put that all in this camera body, they have really raised the bar in terms of what you can get for this price point, and how much fun and how many features and how portable the system is. And so I think it really is the perfect camera to have people fall in love with OMD and then move into all their amazing lenses and accessories and other camera bodies. What's missing here? What's missing from the EM5 Mark III is maybe what's mission critical to 1%. It's 99% all here, and there might be 1% of things, and one of those features, one of those 1% features might be mission critical for your work. I get it. Whether it's better ergonomics when you have gloves on, or it's 60 frames per second in Pro Capture versus 30 frames per second. There are a number of things that might be that 1% difference for you, but 99.9% of the time when you're out on a shoot, this camera can get it done. And that's what makes it amazing at its current point in the lineup, being the prosumer model. And I just don't think that anybody who picks this camera up for the first time isn't going to find it to be a very capable machine. Whether you're shooting video, stills, wildlife, event work, it's all kind of packed into this body. And that's because it really shares so much DNA with the EM1 Mark II. But when that camera came out, it was like, I don't know, right around $2,000, and now we're at half that amount to get an EM5 Mark III. So I think that's an outstanding way for Olympus to raise the bar in the photography world. If you get started with an EM5 Mark III, it's like a deep rabbit hole you're going down, because you're going to fall in love with all of the features, capabilities, and size of the system. And just remember, I want to make the point that no matter what OMD camera that you choose, as you put a kit together, I want you to consider the size of that kit and what it means to getting out and doing work that you love. That's one of the things I think that we can't talk about enough if we're evangelizing a little bit for OMD, as I like to do, is because getting out and shooting is the most important thing. Getting to the photograph is a huge, huge hurdle for some people. And being able to stash this in my coat pocket, being able to work with a small prime kit and be able to work in any light condition, is just a huge win for photography in general, because it means I'm not going to go out and only take photos with this. So the EM5 Mark III is the smallest, lightest sort of pro body, and as a pro's working kit for my own personal documentary work, like with my family, for example, the EM5 Mark III fits it like a glove. So, you know, I just want to say that I really think that this is the core, the DNA of what makes Olympus great, and the size, portability, you know, USB charging, small size, adventure lifestyle, or just ability to have the smallest, lightest, most capable kit. That's really at the heart of what makes Olympus OMD so great. And this camera does not disappoint in that way. So that's kind of my initial thoughts on the camera, guys. If you have questions, hit me up in the comments and we can talk about it. But from here, I want to go through 10 customizations I made to the camera. We'll go through the menus directly and talk about things as the way I set them up. So if you do portrait, documentary type of work, then this might be great for you. So stick around. Okay guys, we're back. I've got my EM5 Mark III here tethered to the computer, and I'm recording the screen so you guys can see exactly what I'm seeing in the menu system. So there's a couple limitations here as we talk about a couple of these customizations, and that's just because with the cameras feeding out the live view to the computer, it's grayed out a couple of options for me. So you'll have to trust me that this works, but I'll show you where they are. So the first customization I want to make is in menu A2. And these are generally all in the gear icon. So if I go to the gear here, that's this little round one, and I go down to A2, the first thing I turn on is the AF targeting pad. Now, with the EM1X, for example, it has a joystick on the back of the camera for moving the autofocus point around, so I can use my thumb to move it. But generally speaking, with the cameras like the EM5 Mark III and the EM1 Mark II, they don't have that joystick. So I really think using the screen is the best way to move the AF point if you're just doing generalized shooting. If you are tracking moving subjects, then you might want to use a specific point and use the phase detect autofocus points. And you can always get back to those by pressing the OK button if you're going ahead and using the contrast detect points that are activated when you use the AF targeting pad. So, just to recap, if you are doing generalized shooting where things aren't moving too quickly, for example, you can use your thumb on the back of the camera to move the autofocus point around while it's up to your eye. And you do that by turning on the AF targeting pad, which is in menu Gear A2. If I'm going to shoot moving things like tracking running kids or even someone walking towards me, then I'm going to want to use the more specific phase detect autofocus points. And you can reach those at any time by pressing the OK button while you're shooting and then moving that autofocus point around with the 4 switches on the back of the camera, the 4-way pad. Okay, so the MF clutch. I always get a little bit of incredulous people, like they will comment on videos saying, I can't believe you've turned off the MF clutch mechanism. But the point is that for me, the Pro lenses from Olympus, there's a clutch on the lens that goes back and forward. And what that does is that it will put the camera into manual focus. And I think it's a great feature for some people if you use a lot of manual focus or if you want that easy override. But for me, there's a little bit too much triggering of that when the camera comes up from my hip and I'm about to take a photograph. So for me, I like disabling my MF clutch because then I can always go into the camera and directly put it into manual focus using the super control panel, and I don't have to worry about that. And the number of times that I use manual focus is very low. So I prefer having the safety of having to go into the super control panel to go into manual focus. If you like the clutch mechanism, you can leave it operable. But for me, you'd go into A4, go to MF clutch, and I would make that inoperative. That means that if I pull the clutch mechanism back on the lens, that it will not put the camera into manual focus. Okay, so probably the most customizable part of any camera is in the button function menu. So we're in gear menu B, and in here you can go in and define what all the buttons, levers, and dials do on the camera for the most part, and redefine how it works for you. Now, in comparison to an EM1 Mark II and an EM1X, I don't think there's any buttons on the EM5 Mark III that are just labeled FN. So they already have a default value, but there's a few customizations that I like to make that make a big difference in the speed of the camera for my work. And the first one is SOVF. So I'm a guy who uses a lot of flash for the work that I do, especially working at night in weddings and things like that. And as you know, if you are using a mirrorless camera, the camera will reflect the exposure as you're looking through the camera. So if you change the shutter speed, the picture, for example, will get brighter or dimmer based on your settings. Same thing with aperture, same thing with ISO. When you are using a flash, you typically are underexposing the picture. You're making the picture darker than you would want it, and then the flash puts the extra light back into the picture to give you a perfect exposure. Well, in order to be able to see when you have the picture underexposed, you need to turn on one of two modes in Olympus cameras. One is SOVF, or Simulated Optical Viewfinder, or Live View Boost. I like SOVF because what it does is it turns the viewfinder only, not the LCD screen, but the viewfinder only, into kind of a fully automatic mode. It will automatically brighten the picture so that it's not reflecting the exposure. It will automatically choose an auto white balance, and it will just give you the best possible image it can, even though it's overriding, in terms of what it's showing you, the settings that you've chosen for the camera. So you are not going to see the exposure that you're making in terms of ambient light. But because you have a flash on the camera, it makes perfect sense because you want to be able to see in the dark, and the flash, of course, is going to make up the light that's missing from your ambient exposure. I hope that makes sense. I have some other videos. If you're curious about any of that, we can go into it in more detail. But to turn on SOVF, I like to use the exposure compensation button on the top of the EM5 Mark III. So that is indicated by a little black and white plus minus. Because I almost always shoot in manual exposure mode, exposure compensation doesn't do much for me. So what I would do is go into button function. I would find where are you? Oh yeah, here we go. The plus minus button, which is again that key on top of the camera, and I would change that to SOVF. Then if I am using the camera and I want to use a flash, I can just quickly hit that button. It will brighten my picture when I'm underexposing. If I hit it again, I go right back to shooting in ambient. Incidentally, SOVF is indicated in the viewfinder and on the back of the camera at the top says SOVF. Live View Boost, on the other hand, has no icon on the screen that shows you that you're in that mode. So I like SOVF because there is some indication of the mode I'm using. Because one pitfall that you can run into is if you turn on SOVF and then you're making changes to the exposure and nothing's happening, you can be quickly frustrated with what's happening in the moment. So just to maintain expediency, I like to be able to quickly turn it on and off with a button, and I like that there's something in the viewfinder that's indicating that I'm in that mode. Okay, so, all three of the top Olympus cameras, the EM1 Mark II, the EM1X, and the EM5 Mark III, have a lever on the back. That's position 1 and position 2. That little lever can do a ton of different things, but it defines at a base level what the two main control dials are doing in each position. So in mode 1, they can do two jobs, one and the other, and then in mode 2, they do two other jobs. For me, I like to go in and define what those are. So if I go into dial function, and then again, I use mostly manual mode. Here you can see that in position 1, my front dial is my shutter speed, my back dial is my aperture, and then if I quickly put the camera into mode 2, then I'm using those same two dials for ISO and white balance. So you can set that up any way that makes sense to you. That's the way that I have it. So there's one unmarked button on this camera, and that is traditionally the depth of field preview button. It's on the front of the camera, kind of down by the lens mount, and what I like to define that button to do is white balance, because there's a dedicated button already for ISO. So on the EM1 Mark II, for example, there's two buttons there. The top one for me brings up ISO and white balance so that I don't have to futz with anything if I quickly want to get in and make changes to those two settings. So in the case of the EM5 Mark III, I had to make a slight change in my workflow with the camera because the ISO button here is on the back, kind of up by your thumb rest. But I needed one for white balance, a direct key for white balance. I just prefer it that way. So I defined the front button on the front of my camera to be my white balance setting. So if I just back out here and we go to button function, you can see that I have my depth of field button, which is the one on the front of the camera, marked as white balance. So now I have direct keys for ISO and white balance, and then I usually just leave my camera in position 1 for changing ISO and shutter speed, and then everything stays dedicated, and it just makes for less mistakes overall when I'm working quickly. Okay. Okay, so another one. This I went over in a video not too long ago, but one of the things that I really have grown to love is that by default in Olympus cameras, the autofocus area, when it's not active, like when you're not actively moving it or pushing the AF button, is a gray color. And for me, it gets really lost sometimes. If I'm quickly looking through the camera, if I just pick it up from my eye, it can take me a second to figure out where it's at. So I like to actually make it a different color. And that's really easy to do if you go into grid settings, which is in D3. So go to grid settings, I go to preset 1, and I'll arrow over, and I have actually made my resting autofocus point white. So that means that I have taken my R, which is red, green, and blue values, all the way up to their highest setting, and then the alpha channel is the brightness of that channel. So this is a very, very, very light gray or white. And that means that if I look through the viewfinder in any kind of dim condition, which is when I'm usually having this problem, I'm getting that white autofocus box. I can see where it's at. You can change this to literally any color under the rainbow. So whatever makes sense for you, whatever gives you kind of that highest contrast or is most visible in the settings in which you photograph, that might make the perfect sense for you. So you just go into that preset 1, make sure it's active, and then as we arrow out, you can see that the resting point of my autofocus is a white box, which I really like. Okay, so beep off. And this is again a controversial thing because I do talk to photographers who who really like the beep. But for me, I don't like the camera making any unnecessary noises, so I don't like an autofocus confirmation beep. But by default, when you first pick the camera up, if you were to press the trigger button to take a photograph, you press it halfway to autofocus, it will beep to confirm that what is in focus. But I just prefer to believe that that's going to happen and see in point of fact, actually, when you're looking through it, there is a little, if I turn the info on here, you can see that there is a little green dot that shows up in the upper right hand corner of the screen. That indicates that you're in focus. That's one way you could do it without a beep. But also, you just kind of get a feel for it. It kind of blinks on and off and you know it's in focus. So no beep for me. So if you want to turn off your beep, you go into menu D4. So this is the gear icon, D4. And then you'll see this little sound icon. Make sure that guy's turned off. Okay, so a couple of movie mode function things. One of the things that I really like about the movie mode functions is I like to be able to use my lever switch to go between changing exposure and then changing the volume of the microphone input. That's really critical when you're shooting video, so I like that to be at my fingertips. So if I go into the movie mode, and please keep in mind when you go in to set movie mode settings, movie mode buttons, you are actually setting a whole new set of parameters for the camera. None of these things will hold true in the still mode, and nothing from the still mode really carries over into the movie mode. So you need to set up both of them independently, even if you're setting them for mostly the same thing. Otherwise you're going to get the defaults in movie mode, and that might frustrate you. So let's go to mode settings, let's go to button lever dial. And when we go into dial function for manual, here's how I like to have this set up. And for me, this is critical because in position 1, I'll quickly set the shutter speed and aperture. And then if I switch to mode 2 on the lever dial on the back, then I can set volume and white balance. I find that's a very nice way to work when I'm doing video. And so I'm constantly having to monitor the audio. So in point of fact, because I use CAF, continuous AF, in video a lot, I'm more often listening to and working with the volume controls and not really focus or exposure when I'm shooting video. So I usually have it in mode 2, and then I'm using that dial if I need to make changes while I'm recording or during between takes. So, okay, so that's the lever settings for movie mode. So just to make sure you guys caught that, we had to go into the movie subcategory, so down to the little movie icon, and then we went to button lever dial within movies, which is separate from the one that's for all the stills. And then as this was in dial function, okay? Okay, so another movie mode one is that I almost always use continuous AF in movies. And you can set that up a bunch of different ways, but if you put the camera into movie mode and I press the OK button, then I make sure that this is in CAF. And what that means is that wherever the autofocus point is located on the screen, it's going to continuously keep that in focus. And for me, that works 99.9% of the time. If I had the camera on a tripod and I'm locked off shooting something that isn't moving, sure, I wouldn't have it in CAF. I'd just switch it over to SAF. But if you're doing anything else, walking, talking, shooting something that's in front of you that's moving, even a little bit, that CAF is going to track whatever is under the autofocus point. Okay, I'll switch back to manual here real quick. So that was number 6. No, that was number 7. Okay, so when you are reviewing photographs, still photographs, there's one little hack that has been passed around a lot, but if you've never seen it before, just to make your day that much easier, and that is that when you magnify the picture after taking one, you would like it to go straight to 100%, and that way you can get a 1-to-1 pixel look at the sharpness of your picture. So to make that change where it automatically jumps to 100% if you magnify the picture, and you would do that by rotating the rear command dial after reviewing a picture. So shoot a picture, hit play, rotate the rear command dial once, it'll jump straight to 100%. I find this invaluable for checking focus and things like that, so it is definitely my preferred way to do it. So what we need to do here is go to menu D2. So back to gear mode, down to D2, and then you want this setting here, this playback magnify default setting, to be equally value. And what that in Olympus speak means is 100% review of your picture. It's 100% magnification of your picture. So super useful. And then, okay, another one that's just, I go in and all of my OMD cameras are set the same way. There is a bias mode that's on by default for the auto white balance to be shifted to warmer colors. It only refers to auto white balance, but it can catch you off guard when you're reviewing your pictures on the camera if all the time you're in auto white balance, things are shifting a little bit to the warm side. So I like to just keep it neutral. So in that case, you would go to menu G, and that is this mode here, white balance, keep warm color, set that to off. And I've just done that for all of my OMDs. It's just one of the default things that I do. And then the last one is, if you've never done this before, it can actually make your life a little nicer, especially if you shoot quickly, and that is record view. So record view means that anytime that you're taking a photograph or a series of pictures and you let off the shutter, then you'll immediately see the last photo that was taken. Some people might really like that. I really don't. I would really have the camera remain active and ready to take the next picture and have no delay in seeing what's happening in front of the lens. I will be more than happy to pull the camera away from my eye and hit the play button if I want to review a picture. So for me, that's a simple one. I just go into the gear icon, the wrench icon rather, and then you go to record view, and that will turn off image review, automatic image review. So that way, the only way you're going to review photographs is if you go ahead and go in and press the play button. So that works for me. So that is actually 10 customizations to the EM5 Mark III that I have made over the first few days of using it. And again, these are based around wedding, event, portrait, documentary work. If you guys have questions about any other feature of the camera, I would love to talk to you about it in the comments. I'll have more videos coming about the EM5 Mark III as the days move forward here. But this has been my initial impressions of the camera, and of course 10 customizations that make sense for my work. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you all in the next one.